a bunk bed on my face. And I laid on my face. The first Negro began to beat. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind me at that time on the left side because I suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat and I began to work my feet. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro had beat to sit on my feet. To keep me from working my feet. I began to scream and one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled my dress. I pulled my dress down and he pulled my dress back up. I was in jail when Medgar Evers was murdered. All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America.
The voice of Fannie Lou Hamer, civil rights leader, activist who just wanted the right to vote. That's our topic tonight on the Timbuktu Report as we take a look at the voting rights, the history of voting rights in the United States of America. That's our topic tonight on the Timbuktu Report. We do hope you will stay with us. Wrong one. How you doing, Dr. Stevenson?
I am well. How
Somebody's going to get fired.
No, you need to talk to your IT man person.
I know. Here's the show open, close. Look, the important thing is that we're here. Thank you for being here. Thank you, all of you who are watching, because this is such an important, timely topic. The voice that you heard at the beginning was the voice of Fannie Lou Hamer, who described her experience at being in jail and being beaten simply because she wanted to register to vote. She wanted to encourage others to register to vote. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. My guest tonight on the Timbuktu Report, Dr. Rick Stevenson, a professor at the University of Florida, professor in African American history and African American studies. Dr. Stevenson is also a man of the cloth, and as he does every week, if you would, please take us to the Lord in prayer before we get started.
Thank you, Lord. Thank you for another day. We bless you for this Veterans Day, and we ask that we be reminded of those women and men, those persons who have served our country in all of our armed forces, for those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice, for those who are still serving, and also for those who will serve. We are grateful that people still desire to protect the Constitution and this country. And then we ask you to bless this time today. We ask you to superintend all that we do and say, that what we might say might bring you glory and enlighten those who hear us. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen, amen. Dr. Rick Stevenson, as you listen to those words that I'm sure you've heard many times, Fannie Lou Hamer describing what took place, she was a sharecropper in Ruralville, Mississippi, and started working toward educating people on the right to vote and how to get their paperwork. And the process was crazy. It wasn't just I show up and I present an ID to vote. They went through all kinds of things.
Yeah, they one of the reasons that voter suppression became so important in the South is because there were so many African Americans who were free after the Civil War. And if you really study the early stages of political history, directly after Civil War, there were over 20 African Americans who had been voted into the Congress and to the Senate. And the fear was that because Black people were becoming so sophisticated in regards to the political process, and understanding the electorate that white Southerners want to prevent them from voting. The problem was that that's a violation of the 15th Amendment. And I guess we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the 15th Amendment states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that really leads into where we are today. There are over 15 states, 30 states in this country that have passed laws prohibiting the voting rights, because the concern is the present, one of the present political organizations is fearful they have nothing to offer people of color. Secondly, that people who come into this country who happen to not necessarily be Anglo-Saxon tend to vote Democratic, or at least participate in that. So in 2010, 24 states implemented restrictions on voting. Alabama required photo IDs, and other states like Ohio and Georgia also enacted voting laws that would prohibit African Americans and people of color from voting.
And when you hear Fannie Lou Hamer talk about how she was beaten, there was an occasion when they were taking a busload of people to back home after a voter registration training, and the
Right,
bus was pulled over, and the police charged the bus driver because the bus was the wrong color.
right,
I think, and so that seems unfathomable.
right.
But then today, with the voter suppression that's going on right now, it can make you go, what in the world is going on?
Yeah, you're right. And going back to that is not the only physical atrocity that Mrs. Hamer experienced. When she was in 1944, she was in the hospital to have a tumor removed, and while she was under anesthesia, the doctor gave her a hysterectomy, and it became part of the Southern medical culture to castrate our Black mothers and sisters and aunts while they were under anesthesia as an attempt to reduce the population. Is a form of genocide in a sense, and it was all done under the guise of eugenics and medical science. So she wasn't only attacked in her body while she was under anesthesia and prevented from having children, but then she was beaten. And I think the thing that makes it so heinous and malicious is they made a Black man do it, two Black men do it, and these Black men had a choice, either beat her or be beaten. And so what do you do in that, right? Why is it that white America constantly puts Black men in this tension with our own women?
Yeah, when I first heard that, and as you said, it's bad enough that she was beaten, but and we've never heard from those Black men who were given the blackjacks and ordered to beat Fannie Lou Hamer. What did become of those men? Even the fact that Fannie Lou Hamer's story is not at the forefront of the civil rights movement in our history books. If you know about Fannie Lou Hamer, chances are you didn't hear about her in school. If you're watching this tonight, please share this, because it's very critical to see how we have moved forward, but these efforts to suppress the vote of Americans is um, acceptable,
Mhm.
and acceptable by the silence of consent. Complicit is the
Mhm.
word that we are hearing today, that
Mhm.
surfaced during what happened with George Floyd. Fannie Lou Hamer died at the age of 59. She carried those physical and psychological pains of what she went through in trying to help the people in her state, Mississippi, still the poorest state in the Union, by the way, and the state where African Americans own the largest amount of land in the United States. But in Mississippi, where Fannie Lou Hamer was just trying to be an American citizen, and the sad thing is, she got put off of her sharecropping farm that seemed like it would be uh, a deliverance, but that was all people knew at the time. And to put all of this in context, that wasn't that long ago. This is, people are still alive. She was only 59. I think
Yeah.
they just celebrated her 100th birthday not long
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But Dr. Stevenson, as a historian, and seeing how history is repeating itself in such a subtle but blatant kind of way, why is it you think that the general public is not seeing this happening all over again?
You mean they're not anticipating it, or they don't see that we're repeating our past? Is that what you're asking me?
Repeating the past, not anticipating. I think because we feel like when laws are passed, that's done.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways of approaching it. First of all, it is because we are so undereducated when it comes to not only our own Black history but American history. For instance, uh, we've heard the phrase, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," and oftentimes that phrase is attributed to Sister Rosa Parks, but in fact, it was Fannie Lou Hamer who made that statement. I think another part of it is that there is a level of comfort that has come with this modicum of integration in America. For some of us, we feel as though, well, we can sit in the front of the bus. We can go to most restaurants. We can attend as many different movies as we like. And so the pressures that were so evident in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s is not there, especially for this younger generation. They tend to gather a lot of their information from social media. And so therefore, historically, they are undereducated. I think that another reason why critical race theory is such a major problem for the Republican Party and for those whites who don't want to talk about history is because it takes us back to the primary sources and it allows us to see how America had developed and how it is continuing. It's just putting on a different coat. In other words, racism in America is still alive and well. It just doesn't look the same way it used to look. It is not as overt, but it's still there. And one of the primary tenets of racism is undereducation. Keep them stupid. Don't let them think. Control the mind, and they won't fight back.
Dr. Rick Stevenson, professor of African American Studies and African History at the University of Florida. Our topic tonight is Fannie Lou Hamer and her efforts to encourage and give people the courage to go through a process to be able to vote. Some of the things, having to guess how many jelly beans in a jar or recite portions of the Constitution, a Constitution by which they were not freely living under, but expected to do things like recite portions of the Constitution. As people have the ability, even those who can go and present the ID that's needed, do you think that if more people knew what it took to be able to vote in 1964, 1965, that they would be more involved?
I think they might. You bring up a couple of really good points. First of all, the original 15th Amendment in 1870 did not include women.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't until later on, I think 5 or 10 years, 6 or 7 months later, that women were included in this notion of voting. But it wasn't until 1965, 100 years later, that the voting rights was passed. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is the assumption is that your vote does not count. And we don't understand how the electoral colleges work. We don't understand how to vote down ballot. We don't pay close enough attention to our midterm elections, and so there is a level of undereducation when it comes to the political process and the electorate that we tend not to pay attention to. And I'll tell you why I think that's important. The Civil War ends in 1865. In 1870, Mississippi, one of the most racist states in the country, has two black senators, Hiram Revels and Blanche Kelso, right? And then Revels leaves and he becomes the president of Alcorn. But 5 years later, after the Civil War, these black people are understand politics enough and the role of their vote enough that they're out there voting. In 1896, there were 20 people of African descent in the Senate and the Congress, right? And so they paid a lot more attention to what was going on politically than we do today. And one of the reasons for that is, and this is my third point, is I think social media. If it's on the internet, it's probably true. Well, probably not. And because we don't spend as much time reading books and sources that will really help us understand, we take our cues from social media, which is oftentimes very inaccurate.
And please, everyone, talk to the people in your sphere of influence, because we got to stop depending on other people to educate us about this country that we call our home. Victoria said we are constantly distracted by the need to feed our minds with distractions bombarding us in the social media, as you pointed out. Think about how much less we talk to each other, talk with people and not two people, text, and we're on the phone. Very few face-to-face interactions. Listen, last night I was at the incredible production at the Hippodrome on the 6 people who were lynched in Newberry. Mm-hmm. Came home, was talking to my son about the song "Strange Fruit." Kanye West did a remix of that, so he was familiar with the song "Strange Fruit." But it is my fault that my child thought Billie Holiday was a man.
Really? That's so interesting.
Billy?
Yeah, but it's Billie.
Who says he's seen it in print?
Right.
Yeah. So our
Right.
children who don't even know some basic stuff that we're picking up along the way. But as Victoria pointed out, if we're not dining together and having conversations and really helping everyone to understand how important it is for them to participate in every aspect of our communities and in voting and the judicial races, as you pointed out, who else
Right.
is going to tell them? And so I pulled up videos and documentaries last night so that he could learn who Billie Holiday was, and he was shocked.
Awesome. And so did he eventually get the theme of the song?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
He got that from Kanye West,
okay.
his remix of it, which I had not heard.
Yeah.
But then he just thought Billie Holiday was a man. And then he says, "This is who I thought Billie Holiday was." And he pulls up the song of Carlton on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And
Yeah.
it's not unusual. It's like, that's Tom Jones. So he
Right.
thought,
Right.
that's my fault.
Right.
That's my fault. But
Yeah. Yeah.
it's such an example how we are moving through this journey and just not understanding our responsibilities as storytellers at our own tables, in
Yeah.
our own homes. And when we get together for this holiday that's coming up, Thanksgiving, have some materials with
Yeah.
you. Educate your family members about where they live in this country and the history of people like Fannie Lou Hamer and what she went through, even being rejected by some people of color because she wasn't educated. She
Yeah.
had to quit school at 12 years old. And because she wasn't as educated as Rosa Parks and Dr. King and some of the other people of the civil rights movement, she did kind of get pushed to the back because she was for real country Mississippi through and through.
Yeah, but you know what's interesting about that? Even though she had to drop out of school when she was 12 years old, she worked full time to help the family. She was one of the founders of SNCC,
Hmm.
along with Ella Baker, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So obviously she had some level of education. I'm not so sure, especially when we begin to think about people coming out of slavery and the Jim Crow era, that having a PhD from a university would have been the best thing at the time anyway. You need a
Well,
PhD in the streets, right? You need
well,
to understand the concepts of where you lived and how to survive in a community that was designed to keep you oppressed.
and I think that's why her story was so powerful, because she had lived all of this.
Mhm.
She was a sharecropper.
Yeah,
Her parents, grandparents were slaves. And in Mississippi, being a sharecropper was pretty much the same thing as being a slave.
yeah. And she
And
worked on a cotton plantation.
mhm,
Do you? I mean, they some of these men and women had to pick 300 and 400 pounds of cotton a day. And cotton's light. So just imagine, the toil and the back break that it took to do that kind of labor. And going back to what you said earlier, I think another aspect is I think the further we get away from Reconstruction, from civil rights, the softer we get. I think that some of our young people don't don't understand the kinds of struggle that our parents and our grandparents went through, and maybe some of the things that you and I went through, right? Because once we get into the 80s, life does begin to shift, and there is a sense in which the toils, though they are still there, they're less covert, right? And so
yeah,
therefore the assumption is, because I'm not getting knocked over the head with it all the time, it's not as bad as it was.
not, not as bad. But Dr. Rick Stevenson, I think that also part of why there's not as much dialogue as there should be. I think about the Jewish community and how they have continued to talk about the Holocaust.
Hmm.
Black people in the United States of America have gone through such pain and degradation that I think that we have wanted to hide it, suppress it, so we could try to move forward. And that stopped us from doing what we knew how to do best, and that was be storytellers.
Yeah,
And part of it is shame too. Remember, when folks left the South and went north, they didn't want anybody to know that they were that they were cotton pickers and
sure,
that they had worked on farms. They had
sure,
moved north to a better life, and they wanted to look like they did and didn't
sure.
want the stench and the sweat of their brow to be part of their stories anymore.
Sure. It's interesting though. I think there's another aspect to it, and that is, I showed a video of the Middle Passage to one of my classes the other day, and I asked them, "Well, how many of you ever seen that?" And most of them had not. Some of them had, and then I began to break down and analyze the experience, right? And there's a former doctor. His name is Alexander Falconbridge. He was on several different slave ships, but this one particular slave ship, he talks about these Africans moaning, groaning, crying, and being in melancholy. We might call that depression. And I started asking my students, what do you think was the psychosis experienced by these young people? I said, I want you to think of yourself as a 14-year-old kid who just got snatched from your village. You find yourself in the middle of the ocean. The ship is rocking. It's 120 degrees. People are dying around you. What kind of psychological effect do you think it had on those kids? And they couldn't fathom it. They were like, no one ever told us about the psychological effect of slavery, right? And I think
Yeah.
that, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just agreeing.
Yeah. And I
You
think
know what? Part of that too is because we're not supposed to have feelings,
exactly. And or because we we were not going to show weakness that further fortified this notion that we didn't feel pain. But the deal was we just were not going to show them our pain, right? But then it became normal to be stressed like that. It becomes a part of what it meant to be Black, right?
Yeah, yeah. Dr. Rick Stevenson, our topic tonight is about how the residual effects of what Fannie Lou Hamer went through as a Black woman in the South, a Black woman in the South, trying to encourage people and teaching people all of the steps that they had to go through in order to be able to register to vote. And you talked about other people who were elected. Fannie Lou Hamer ran for the US Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Then she ran for a House position in the state of Mississippi. To have that kind of courage to keep pushing forward in such an oppressive situation. She walked with a limp for the rest of her life as a result of that beating that she suffered in that jail just because she wanted to vote.
Yeah, and she dedicated her life to fighting for civil rights, working for students, and oftentimes the SNCC and other organizations, they were met with violence. I mean, violent acts from angry whites who felt that Black people were not staying in their place. She was arrested because she was an activist. And one of the things I started out in my class, I asked my students, first day of class, how many of you would say that you are revolutionary? And for the most part, oftentimes they would even say, I don't even know what a revolutionary is.
Mm.
This is 2021. And is that kind of brainwashing or undereducation about the fact that we're still in a battle. We are still fighting the same battles today in 2021 that my grandparents fought and that their grandparents fought. We're still fighting for health care. We're still fighting for good education. We're still fighting for the right to vote. If the Republican Party has its way, Black people will not vote in this next election. You hear me?
Yeah, yeah. And that's where all of us individually and collectively come in. Jesse Moore in Jackson, Tennessee, thank you so much for watching. She says, I agree with the comments regarding discussion of Black history. And it was at Lane College and HBCU where she was introduced to so many of the names and understanding the struggle. And if you don't go to an HBCU, then you have to go to the table. And that's what I'm encouraging us to do, to have more of these kinds of discussion, because as you say, the further we get away from it, the more it seems that we think all is well.
Mm-hmm. And
How quickly do you think how quickly do you see that things could make a dramatic shift in this country as a result of voter suppression laws?
Oh my goodness. Well, it depends on the kind of depression law. If, for instance, one of the things that has occurred, and North Carolina was accused of this, and then found to have had a laser focus on preventing Black people from voting. They changed one of the days of voting. We used to have this thing called Souls to the Polls. And that's primarily when Black people voted on Sunday. Why? Because Black people go to church. So in some states like North Carolina, they stop Souls to the Polls. But then you have states where they have these various types of ID laws. And if you don't have a certain type of ID, or if you're a college student and you have a college ID, but you don't have a government ID, you can't vote. And so in states where you could pre-register if you were 16 or 17 years old, where you were previously allowed to use your driver's license as ID, and these states say those are no longer valid, you're cutting out a significant population of the voting black population now. And add to that the number of black people who are in prison. And then even when they come out, if they're felons, and we just had a law passed here in Florida where felons are now able to vote. If you have a felony, you cannot vote. So we make up 14% of the American population, but we make up over 55% of the prison population. So how many votes have we lost just because someone's been incarcerated? So I think that if we're not paying attention to what's going on around here and how the Republican Party is hell bent on preventing people of color, black people in general, particular, and then Hispanics, etc., this United States could change very drastically.
Dr. Rick Stevenson, I thank you so much for sharing tonight this whole issue of what it means to be able to vote, as Fannie Lou Hamer worked so hard, dedicated her life, and died in the struggle, as they say, to encourage people to get registered to vote, to participate in this process on every level. Please do not forget to pay attention to who's running for judge, who's running for district attorney. These are people who determine what bed you sleep in at night, whether it's at your home or it's in a jail cell.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Stevenson, what word of advice would you give as we are headed toward, you mentioned midterm elections, and people they just don't participate in those elections as much as they should?
I would say, one, if you are not registered, get registered. That's the first thing. The second thing is every single person who is running for office, you can look them up on Florida.gov or some other website that will show you their voting record. You can read up on what they've done and what their did I just leave? Yeah. And what their voting history is. And that way we don't have to go in blind. If you're not sure, call an adult that you know. Call the university. Call the political sciences, the political science department at US, and ask for Dr. Austin. She'll give you some insight. I think that here in Florida, I think that we have to take steps to better educate ourselves when it comes to voting. We cannot rely on the oppressor to give us information to overthrow their ability to oppress us. That doesn't make sense, right? Yeah. So we have to use our alternatives. And I think that we have to spend a little less time on TikTok and YouTube and Facebook, and a little bit more time in the library looking at primary source documents, looking at archival documents. So we'll understand how white America has laid the foundation for what we now experience today, because they haven't changed the game plan. The game plan is the same, right? It's the same plan. We just have to know what it is so we can recognize it when we see it.
Dr. Rick Stevenson, Professor of African American Studies and African History at the University of Florida. Tonight we've been talking about a very, very, very special woman and her works to encourage people to vote. And I played this at the beginning of the show. Her story is so powerful of how she was beaten. I'm going to close the show with her voice again, because
by orders from the State Highway Patrolman for me to lay down on a bunk bed on my face. And I laid on my face, the first Negro began to beat. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind me at that time on the left side because I suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat until he was exhausted, the State Highway Patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat, and I began to work my feet. And the State Highway Patrolman ordered the first Negro had beat to sit on my feet, to keep me from working my feet. I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled my dress. I pulled my dress down, and he pulled my dress back up. I was in jail when Medgar Evers was murdered. All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America.